The day Karoline Leavitt taught the most arrogant TV host a lesson. The studio lights were harsh, too harsh, the kind that makes you sweat even when you're perfectly composed. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't rattled in the slightest. She sat down gracefully, legs crossed, back straight, her expression calm yet confident, like she belonged there, like she had nothing to prove. The audience whispered with anticipation. Some had their phones already recording. They could sense it. Something was about to happen. Across from her sat Isen Calvel, a television host infamous for his cunning interviews, full of traps designed to embarrass politicians, activists, and celebrities alike. But Karoline? She was a different kind of guest, uncharted territory. Isen leaned forward slightly, that smug smile playing on his lips, the kind that said he believed he had already won. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "you've always represented a certain traditional image of strength and American values. But don't you think that view is outdated? Isn't it time we redefine what it means to be strong in today's world?" A few quiet chuckles echoed through the audience. His followers were ready to watch him dismantle yet another guest with his carefully rehearsed provocations. Karoline blinked, slowly. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbows gently on her knees. She exhaled quietly through her nose. "So now," she said in a calm, firm tone, "being strong is a problem?" Isen gave a smirk. "Well, I think we've moved past the days where people had to handle everything with toughness and grit. Maybe strength isn't about standing firm anymore. Maybe it's about being emotionally open." Silence. Thick, uncomfortable silence. Karoline scratched her chin thoughtfully, then let out a soft laugh, but it wasn't polite. It was sincere, confident. "Are you serious?" she asked. "You really think strength is the issue here?" Isen adjusted his tie, but for the first time there was a flicker in his eyes, something that hinted he wasn't quite as sure of himself as before. "I think strength can be damaging," he offered, "when it's used to hide vulnerability." Karoline nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Then, with steady composure, she leaned back into her chair and casually draped her arms over the sides. "Let me ask you something," she said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't rush, it simply carried weight. "If someone breaks into your home tonight, would you prefer someone who can protect you, or someone who sits down and tries to talk through their emotions with the intruder?" A few quiet gasps rippled through the room. Then came the applause, hesitant at first but quickly gaining momentum. Isen opened his mouth to speak, but Karoline wasn't finished. "Strength isn't about shouting louder than others or being rigid," she continued. "It's about standing firm when life tries to knock you down. It's about protecting your family. It's about discipline, respect, and hard work." She paused, then shook her head slightly, her tone tinged with disappointment. "If you really believe the world doesn't need that anymore, then I'm not sure what world you're living in." Isen forced a laugh, but the crack in his confidence was now obvious. For the first time on his own show, he looked uncertain. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. "Okay," he said, sitting straighter. "But let's be honest. Don't you think the media, and especially your side of politics, has glorified toughness as the only solution to conflict?" Karoline didn't even blink. "The media glorifies a lot of things," she replied without missing a beat. She gave a brief smile and leaned in slightly. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a politician save the country by filing paperwork?" This time the laughter was real. Even some of Isen's staff couldn't help but smile. But Isen wasn't done, not yet. The host straightened in his chair, flipping through his cue cards with surgical precision. He knew how to control the tempo of a conversation, how to walk his guests right to the edge of a trap, letting them fall without even realizing it. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't walking into anything. She wasn't playing his game. "Let's talk about influence," Isen said, his fingers casually grazing the next card like he was about to play a winning hand. "You've built your public image on being bold, unapologetic. You take strong stances. You don't bend. But don't you think there's a responsibility, especially with younger audiences watching, to promote, let's say, a more progressive kind of leadership?" That final word, progressive, was no accident. The audience caught it immediately. Karoline tilted her head slightly, then straightened in her seat, stretching her shoulders like she was warming up for a new round. Calm, focused, ready. First of all, she said with quiet authority, I deal in real-life policies, not fairy tales. She leaned forward, lifting an eyebrow. This isn't about movies, slogans, or hashtags. Real leadership means standing by your principles, especially when it's unpopular. And let me remind you, principles aren't always trendy. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Because as far as I remember, she continued with a faint smile, I've never delivered a campaign promise by posting a selfie. I've never fixed inflation by virtue signaling on social media. And I certainly haven't solved national problems by trying to make everyone happy. This time, the laughter was louder. Even some of Isen's own team chuckled behind the cameras. But Isen wasn't finished. Sure, he said, smiling tightly, but you know pop culture shapes how people think. Kids grow up seeing strong personalities in politics. And some would say that what we need now are leaders who show more empathy than toughness. Leaders who avoid conflict, who build consensus. Karoline exhaled through her nose slowly and then shook her head. Have you actually listened to what I say? She asked. The point of what I stand for isn't about creating conflict. It's about standing your ground when it counts. It's about heart. It's about perseverance. And if that's seen as threatening, then maybe the problem isn't the message, but how soft the audience has become. The crowd responded with applause, this time longer, more confident. Isen clenched his jaw. He realized this wasn't going the way he expected, so he switched gears. His tone softened, more serious now, like he was pivoting towards something personal. Okay, fair enough, he said, his voice lower. But let's talk about the real world, about America. We're living in a time where people are rethinking what it means to be a man, what it means to be strong. Some say that your version of strength, the old school don't show weakness mindset, is part of the problem, that it divides people more than it unites them. He left the question hanging, hoping Karoline would feel cornered, but she didn't blink. Instead, she tapped her fingers gently on the armrest, her gaze locked on his. Then, in a calm, steady voice, she spoke. Have you ever met a firefighter? Isen blinked. Excuse me? A firefighter, Karoline repeated. Or a police officer, a soldier, or how about a single mother who works 2 jobs just to keep food on the table for her kids? Silence. Do you think their problem is being too strong? She asked, shaking her head slowly with a half-smile of disbelief. No, their strength is exactly what keeps this country going. The problem isn't strength, she continued. The problem is that we've let some people convince us that being strong is dangerous, that discipline, resilience, and moral conviction are somehow toxic. She leaned forward just a little, her voice never rising but carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. Being weak isn't the same as being virtuous, my friend. Real strength means having control. It means protecting people, even when it's not easy, even when it costs you something. Somewhere in the crowd, a soft whistle escaped, followed by a ripple of applause. The tone in the studio had shifted completely. Isen could feel it. He knew it, and he tried to recover quickly. But what about... Karoline raised a hand, not with aggression, but with the quiet command of someone who wasn't finished speaking yet. Do you want to know what the real problem is? Karoline asked, locking eyes with him. Isen swallowed hard. The problem isn't strength, she said slowly, letting every word carry weight. The problem is people who talk about strength like it's something to be ashamed of, like it's dangerous, while they live comfortably in a world that was built and protected by strong people. She paused, letting the silence settle heavily across the studio. You're sitting there in your expensive suit, reading from a script filled with curated questions, trying to tell me what values are outdated. Another pause. Then, in a quieter, almost advisory tone, she leaned forward. Let me tell you something, my friend, she said. If the day ever comes when this world truly starts to fall apart, when the systems break, when safety disappears, you're going to be really thankful that people like me still exist. Absolute silence. For the first time in the entire interview, Isen had no comeback. He didn't smirk. He didn't interrupt. He simply sat there, visibly thrown off. The audience could feel it. The energy had shifted completely. They were no longer with him. They were watching Karoline, waiting for what she'd say next. And she wasn't about to let go of control. Isen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew he had lost the room. This was not going according to plan. He hadn't gotten her to stumble. She hadn't gone on the defensive. Karoline wasn't just responding, she was commanding the room. He tried to force a smile. "I really do understand where you're coming from," he said, his voice now carefully measured. "But let's be honest, there's a difference between being strong and refusing to change." He paused again, strategically. "Many would argue that your mindset, your so-called old-school values, are what's holding society back. That real progress can't happen unless we let go of those rigid ideas." The audience collectively held its breath. Everyone was waiting to see what Karoline would say next. And Karoline, she hadn't even begun to throw her hardest punches. "Don't you think it's time to move forward?" Isen asked, crossing his arms in an attempt to regain control. Karoline let out a slow breath, her gaze steady. She could have gone for another sharp retort, but instead her tone shifted. It became more reflective, almost like she was letting the truth speak for itself. "Have you ever seen a building being torn down?" she asked. Isen frowned. "What?" "A building," she clarified. "Have you ever watched one collapse?" Isen hesitated. "I suppose, yes." Karoline nodded slightly. "It takes what, 10 seconds? A couple of charges, a button press, and boom, it's gone." She folded her hands calmly on her lap. "But have you ever watched a building being constructed?" Isen didn't answer. "It takes years," she said, "brick by brick, steel on steel, workers laying foundations day and night, making sure it can stand, making sure it lasts." She paused, letting the image take hold. "But the people holding the detonators, they don't care about the sweat, the labor, the risk, the people who gave everything to build it. They just want to watch it fall." Silence. The audience was locked in. "You say we need to move forward," Karoline continued, "but I ask, forward to where? Not every change is progress. Sometimes people are so obsessed with tearing down the old that they never stop to ask whether what they're destroying might still be worth protecting." Isen licked his lips. The moment was pressing down on him. He had entered the interview expecting an easy target, a young conservative he could reduce to a stereotype. But he had been wrong, and the audience knew it. Okay, Isen said with a forced laugh. "That's an interesting point of view." He tried to salvage what was left of his position. "But let's be honest, society has changed. We're not living in the same era as before. People are more aware now. We think more critically about gender roles, about systemic problems." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Think critically?" she repeated. "Or just criticize?" The audience erupted. Applause broke out. Some gasped. Even members of Isen's own crew exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a reckoning. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a battle. Isen raised her hands, trying to regain control of the room. Okay, she said, her voice trying to cut through the rising noise. "Let me just ask you this. If strength, if resilience is so important, then why do so many people reject it? Why do some people think it's no longer necessary?" Karoline didn't rush to respond. She let the question hang in the air for a moment, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice into something close to a whisper, calm, controlled, cutting, because weak people don't like being reminded that they're weak. The audience erupted. Some stood and applauded. Others just stood in stunned silence. Isen opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. Karoline sat back slowly, letting the wave of reactions settle on its own. "Look," she said, her voice calmer now, but still steady, "I'm not saying everyone has to be a warrior or a public servant or a champion of something." She glanced at the audience, then returned her gaze to Isen. "What I'm saying is simple. Life is going to hit you, whether you're ready or not. And when it does, the world won't stop to ask how you feel. It won't give you a break because you're emotional or overwhelmed." She paused again, the silence thick. "The world will ask you one thing. Will you take the hit and keep going?" Complete silence. Isen had nothing. No witty retort. No intellectual comeback. No closing argument. Only the echo of Karoline's words, which now hung in the studio like a truth no one could unhear. But outside that studio, something even bigger was unfolding. Because the moment that clip hit the internet, everything changed. As soon as the camera stopped rolling, Isen barely managed to hold her forced professional smile. The crew was already tense. The air felt heavy. But Karoline? She simply stood up, calmly stretched her shoulders, gave the audience a polite wave, and walked off the set as if nothing had happened. Backstage, chaos erupted. Producers were scrambling. Studio screens were flashing metrics, spiking by the second. And Isen's earpiece was buzzing nonstop with frantic voices. That didn't go how we planned. Social media is already blowing up. Cut the controversial parts before it airs. But it was already too late. Someone from the live audience had recorded the entire exchange and posted it online. Within minutes, the internet was on fire. Karoline Leavitt shuts down arrogant host live. Young politician obliterates mainstream narrative in brutal interview. This is why we need real leaders like Karoline Leavitt. The video spread like wildfire, jumping from Twitter to Facebook, from YouTube to TikTok. Clips were chopped, edited, turned into memes, remixed with slow-motion replays and dramatic music. Within hours, the clip was trending #1. The comment sections became a battlefield. Some cheered her strength, others attacked her stance. But everyone was talking. The television network went into full crisis mode. They scrambled to release a carefully crafted statement. We believe in respectful dialogue and diverse opinions. Moments like these are opportunities for meaningful conversations. Isen tried to calm the outrage on Twitter. Healthy debate matters. I respect Ms. Leavitt's views, even if I disagree. Let's keep the conversation civil. But it was pointless. The internet had already made up its mind. Meanwhile, Karoline, she didn't post anything, no tweet, no press statement, no reaction. She just went on with her life, like the so-called scandal didn't exist. Because unlike those arguing in the comments, she had nothing to prove. But as the dust began to settle, a bigger question started surfacing. Was this just another viral clip? Or had Karoline Leavitt just revealed something deeper, something uncomfortable, about the way modern media truly works? Days passed, but the video kept burning. They weren't just talking about Karoline Leavitt anymore. They were talking about something much bigger. The real debate had begun. On one side were the people who said Karoline had exposed the hypocrisy of the modern media. Hosts like Isen always had an agenda. They wanted public figures to nod, comply, and play the game. But the moment someone thinks for themselves, someone who refuses to be cornered, they unravel. On the other side were the critics. They said Karoline was just another young politician clinging to old-fashioned ideas. It's easy to talk about strength, they argued, when you've never had to survive paycheck to paycheck. But then something unexpected happened. The voices that no one saw coming started speaking up. Not journalists, not influencers, real people. Firefighters, police officers, army veterans, factory workers, construction crews, single moms. Not people who debated strength in a fancy studio, but those who lived it every single day. A former Marine posted a message on Facebook that went viral. Karoline gets it. Strength isn't about being loud or cruel. It's about getting back up when life knocks you flat. And we need more of that. An Oklahoma mother uploaded a video, raw and tearful. I raised 3 kids on my own. If I hadn't been strong, they wouldn't have eaten. Don't sit there and tell me strength is a bad thing. And then one simple, powerful moment, a short clip, an elderly man at a gas station watching the interview on his phone, shaking his head. These young people, they think life is about arguing on TV. That girl, she understands the real world. In the end, it wasn't about Karoline. It wasn't even about Isen. It was about something much bigger, something no one saw coming. Meanwhile, Isen vanished from the spotlight. Her network tried to change the subject, push new stories, distract the audience. But nothing stuck, because every time they tried to pivot, the same question came back. Why did a young politician have more common sense than a professional journalist? That was when the real conversation began. Not about politics, not about the interview, but about a society that had forgotten the value of strength, a society that had grown soft, where people feared real toughness so much they pretended it wasn't necessary anymore, where the media no longer reflected the culture, they controlled it. But now that control was breaking. These weren't just viral clips anymore. They were dinner table conversations. People weren't just watching, they were waking up. And Karoline Leavitt, she still hadn't said a word. Not a post, not a press statement, nothing. A week later, she finally spoke up, but not on TV, not on Twitter. In a small community center gym in New Hampshire, a local journalist asked her about the viral moment, hoping for a public statement or some kind of damage control. Karoline wiped sweat from her brow, took a sip of water, and smiled. "Look, I wasn't trying to go viral," she said. "I was just being honest." The reporter pressed, "Did you expect this reaction?" She laughed. "I've been in politics long enough to know people are always shocked when someone just tells the truth." That was it. No grand performance, no speech crafted by advisors, just a young woman who said what she believed and moved on, but the real impact was just beginning. Isen Calvel's show began losing viewers. Her network moved her to lower profile segments. They didn't cancel her, but the rising star was gone. Meanwhile, something unusual started happening. People began to see Karoline Leavitt differently. Her older interviews resurfaced. Her speeches went viral. Even old clips of her debates were being shared again, but now with a new lens. And then one video clip exploded everywhere. It wasn't a speech or a soundbite. It was a quote. "The world won't care how you feel. It will only ask, are you going to take the hit and keep going?" It became more than a moment. It became a movement, not a trend, a mindset shift. Offline in the real world, something changed. Boxing gyms saw a surge in young men and women, not just chasing muscles, but looking for discipline. Parents started talking to their kids about effort, not just entitlement. Workers faced their struggles with determination, not complaints. And none of it happened because Karoline Leavitt told them to. It happened because they saw clearly the difference between real strength and weakness, disguised as virtue. Because deep down, this was never about a single interview. It was never about Karoline versus Isen. It was about a world that had forgotten what it meant to be strong, and one young woman who reminded them of the truth. If you've made it this far, ask yourself, what kind of strength do you value? The one that crumbles the moment it's questioned, or the one that stands tall when it matters most? Because in the end, toughness isn't about muscles. It's about who you are when no one's watching. Like this story? Subscribe for more stories that make you think. Because in a world full of noise, truth still matters.